You might find yourself doing it without even thinking. You're sitting at a desk or standing in line, and your thumb absent-mindedly reaches over to rub the base of your ring finger. Maybe there's a band of gold there, or maybe there's just the memory of one. It's a tiny, quiet gesture. A mundane habit of the modern world. But that simple movement of skin against skin is actually a biological echo of a revolution that happened before we even had a word for forever. We think of weddings as white dresses, tiered cakes, and legal contracts signed in quiet offices. We think of them as an invention of civilization, something we created once we had cities and laws to protect our property. But the truth is much older and much stranger. The wedding didn't start with a priest or a party. It started as a survival strategy in a world that was trying to kill us. The ice changed everything. If we want to find the first I do, we have to go back way beyond the first city. We have to travel back 300,000 years to the African savanna. At this point in deep time, the idea of a wedding would have been nonsensical. Our ancestors lived in groups where mating was often a matter of competition and dominance. But then, something shifted in our biology. If you look at the fossil record of early hominids like Ardipithecus ramidus, which lived over 4 million years ago, you see something startling. The giant, dagger-like canine teeth that male apes used to fight each other for female attention started to shrink. Evolutionary biologist Owen Lovejoy argues that this is the first physical evidence of a social wedding. When the teeth got smaller, it meant the males had stopped fighting each other and started providing instead. They began carrying food back to specific females. They were trading aggression for investment. This was the birth of the pair bond. It wasn't a ceremony, it was a biological contract written in the shape of our skulls. By the time the first Homo sapiens appeared 300,000 years ago, we weren't just mating, we were partnering. But the pair bond was just the beginning. Fast forward to 34,000 years ago. We are in the middle of a frozen wasteland in what is now modern-day Russia, at a site called Sungur. Archaeologists found something here that shattered our understanding of ancient relationships. They found burials of people dripping in ivory beads and fox teeth. But when geneticists like Martin Sikora analyzed the DNA of these individuals, they found they weren't closely related. They weren't a small, inbred clan. These people were traveling hundreds of miles to find partners from other groups. They had created a marriage network across the tundra. This was the first time humans used partnership to build a map of the world. They realized that if you marry someone from the tribe over the mountain, you don't just get a partner, you get an ally. You get a place to sleep when the reindeer move north. You get a safety net. These weren't romantic weddings, they were diplomatic summits. And because we did this, and the Neanderthals mostly didn't, we are the ones still here to talk about it. Then the world warmed up. Around 10,000 years ago, the glaciers retreated and humans did something radical. We stayed put. We invented the farm. This is the moment when the wedding stopped being a biological survival tactic and started becoming a business merger. Before the Neolithic Revolution, you couldn't really own much. You moved with the seasons. But once you have a wheat field and a herd of goats, you have something to lose. You have property. And if you have property, you need to know exactly who your children are so you can give that property to them when you die. This is where the concept of legitimacy was born. Marriage became the fence around the field. In sites like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, we see houses built so close together they don't have doors. People walked on the roofs and dropped down into their homes. Inside those homes, researchers have found couples buried together under the floorboards. It's a literal representation of "until death do us part." They were anchoring their families to the land, using the bond between two people to claim a piece of the earth forever. The plow demanded a contract. By the time we reach 3500 BC in Mesopotamia, the quiet era of marriage was over. This is the Bronze Age, and this is where weddings got loud and legal. In the city-states of Sumer, marriage was a transaction so important it had to be carved into clay. We have found thousands of these tablets. They aren't love letters. They are lists of silver, sheep, and grain. The Sumerian word for marriage was actually the same word for to be filled. It was about completing a household. One of the most famous examples of an early wedding isn't a human one, but the sacred marriage of the goddess Inanna and the shepherd king Dumuzi. This was a massive public ritual where the king and a high priestess would enact a wedding to ensure the fertility of the land. It tells us that by this point, the union of two people wasn't just a private matter. It was a cosmic one. If the wedding didn't happen, the crops wouldn't grow. The entire weight of the state was now resting on the shoulders of a couple. The law became the priest. As we move into the era of the great empires, around 2000 BC, we see the first formal rules for weddings appearing in places like the Code of Ur-Nammu and later the Code of Hammurabi. These laws tell us that a wedding wasn't a wedding unless there was a witness. You couldn't just say you were married. You had to have a verdict. In ancient Egypt, the system was surprisingly different. While the Babylonians were obsessed with clay contracts, the Egyptians were remarkably casual. For most of Egyptian history, there was no religious ceremony at all. There was no walking down the aisle toward a statue of Ra. A wedding was simply the act of a woman bringing her furniture into a man's house. The Egyptian word for marriage literally translates to founding a house. They didn't care about the ritual, they cared about the cohabitation. But don't let the lack of a party fool you. The Egyptians took the partnership part more seriously than almost anyone else. Women in ancient Egypt had the legal right to own land, run businesses, and initiate a divorce. A wedding, there was a partnership of equals, at least on paper, which is more than we can say for the cultures that followed them. The shadow of the father grew long. By the time we get to the Iron Age, around 1000 BC, the wedding had taken a darker turn in many parts of the world. In ancient Greece, specifically in Athens, the wedding was a transfer of property where the woman was the property. The ceremony was called the ekdosis, which means giving away. The father of the bride would stand before the groom and say, "I give you this woman for the procreation of legitimate children." There was no "I do" from the bride. She didn't have a voice in the contract. The ceremony was essentially a torchlight procession where the groom kidnapped the bride from her father's house and took her to his own. It was a ritualized theft. But even within Greece, there were exceptions that make our modern skin crawl. In Sparta, the wedding was a covert military operation. A Spartan groom would capture his bride, but then he wasn't allowed to live with her. He had to sneak out of his military barracks in the middle of the night, visit her in the dark, and sneak back before dawn. Some Spartan men fathered entire families before they ever saw their wives in the light of day. It was a wedding designed to keep the man's primary loyalty to the state, not the family. The cake became a weapon. Then came Rome. The Romans were the master architects of the modern wedding. They invented almost everything we recognize today: the ring, the veil, the bridesmaids, and even the cake. But for the Romans, these weren't just cute traditions. They were legal markers. There were 3 types of Roman weddings. The most elite was called conferiatio, where the couple shared a special cake made of emmer wheat in front of the high priest of Jupiter. This was a hard marriage. Once you ate that cake, you were legally bound in a way that was almost impossible to break. It was reserved for the families who ran the empire. But for everyone else, there was usus. This was the common man's wedding. If a man and woman lived together for 1 year, they were legally married. But the Romans, being obsessed with loopholes, created an escape clause. If a woman stayed away from her husband's house for 3 nights every year, the marriage clock reset. She remained under the legal protection of her own father instead of her husband. It was the world's first living together agreement with a built-in exit strategy. The sword replaced the ring. As the Roman Empire crumbled and the world moved into the early Middle Ages, the wedding moved north into the forests of the Vikings and the Celts. For the Norse, a wedding was a multi-day feast that involved an incredible amount of ale. But the heart of the Viking wedding wasn't the party, it was the morning gift. The day after the wedding, the groom was legally required to hand over a significant portion of his wealth directly to his bride. Not to her father, not to a joint account, but to her. This gave Viking women a level of financial independence that would be forgotten in Europe for the next 1,000 years. And the ritual itself? It often involved the groom presenting his bride with an ancestral sword, and her presenting him with one in return. It was a pact of mutual defense. They weren't just starting a family, they were forming a two-person shield wall against a very violent world. The steps became the promise. While Europe was obsessing over swords and legal loopholes, the Vedic traditions in ancient India were developing a completely different philosophy of the wedding. In the Saptapadi, or the 7 steps, the wedding wasn't a contract or a transfer of property. It was a journey. The couple would take 7 steps together around a sacred fire, with each step representing a different aspect of their shared future: food, strength, wealth, wisdom, progeny, seasons, and friendship. Historians note that this is one of the few ancient traditions where the bond is framed as a spiritual friendship rather than a legal transaction. There was even a tradition called Swayamvara, where a woman of high status could actually choose her own husband from a group of suitors. In a world where almost every wedding was arranged by fathers for the sake of land or titles, this was a radical recognition of female agency. It reminds us that even in the deepest parts of our history, there were always people trying to make the wedding about the two people standing in the center of it. The goose symbolized the soul. In ancient China, the wedding was a choreographed dance of symbolism that started long before the couple met. It began with the 6 rites. The most important was the presentation of a live goose. Why goose? Because geese mate for life and fly in formation. It was a living symbol of the ordered relationship that the state demanded. A Chinese wedding wasn't just about 2 people, it was about the harmony of the entire universe. If the rituals were done incorrectly, if the tea was served wrong or the hair wasn't tied in the proper knot, it was believed that the natural order of the world would be disrupted. The wedding was the anchor for the social hierarchy. It was the smallest unit of the empire. If the family was stable, the empire was stable. This is why Chinese weddings were so elaborate and so strictly controlled. You weren't just marrying a person, you were fulfilling your duty to your ancestors and to the emperor himself. The knot was tied in blood. Across the ocean, the Aztecs had their own version of tying the knot. In a literal ceremony, the matchmaker would tie the hem of the groom's cloak to the corner of the bride's blouse. This wasn't just a metaphor for their union, it was a physical reminder that they were now one entity. But the Aztec wedding also had a gritty, practical side. After the knot was tied, the couple would sit on a reed mat for 4 days of fasting and prayer. They were breaking their old selves to become something new. It was a psychological transition as much as a social one. And in the Mayan world, weddings were often timed to the cycles of the stars. You didn't get married when you felt like it, you got married when Venus was in the right position. The wedding was a gear in a celestial clock. To the Maya, a marriage that didn't align with the stars was a marriage that was doomed to fail. The paper followed the plow. If you look at all these cultures, from the frozen tundra of Russia to the stepped pyramids of Mexico, a pattern starts to emerge. The wedding has always been a mirror. When we were hunters, it was a social network. When we were farmers, it was a property fence. When we were empire builders, it was a legal contract. We think we invented the wedding to celebrate love, but the history books suggest we invented it to solve problems. We used it to decide who gets the goats, who owns the land, and who has to fight in the war. Love was often the accidental byproduct, a lucky coincidence that happened after the paperwork was filed. But there is a secret hidden in the history of the wedding that most people miss. Even in the most oppressive, patriarchal, property-obsessed eras of our past, humans were always finding ways to subvert the system. We find love poems scratched into the walls of Roman ruins. We find Egyptian wives demanding their own bank accounts. We find Viking women holding their mourning gifts like shields. The surprise is that we are still here. When you look at the statistics of ancient marriage, it seems impossible that it survived as an institution. In many ancient societies, life expectancy was so low that the average, "till death do us part," lasted less than 10 years. Divorce was common in Rome, Egypt, and Scandinavia. Infidelity was a constant theme in ancient literature. The perfect nuclear family we see on television today is a historical blink of an eye. For most of human history, the wedding was a messy, evolving, often brutal experiment in how to get 2 people to stay in the same room long enough to raise a child without killing each other. And yet, we keep doing it. We keep putting on the rings. We keep tying the knots. We keep sharing the cake. We have spent 300,000 years trying to perfect a ritual that is, by its very nature, impossible to perfect. The world changed, but we didn't. We like to think of ourselves as modern. We have apps that let us swipe through thousands of potential partners in a single afternoon. We have legal systems that recognize all kinds of partnerships that would have baffled an ancient Athenian. But when you strip away the technology and the modern legal jargon, we are still that person in the Russian tundra 34,000 years ago. We are still reaching outside our own small circles, trying to find someone to help us survive the cold. We are still using partnership as a way to map out a world that feels increasingly chaotic and dangerous. The wedding isn't a tradition we inherited from the Victorians or the Romans. It's a biological imperative that we've been dressing up in different costumes for millennia. It is the oldest technology we have for building a future. The gift was never the gold. If there is one thing that ancient history teaches us about marriage, it's that the ceremony is the least important part. The Sumerians had their clay tablets, the Romans had their wheat cakes, and the Aztecs had their knots. But all of those objects are now dust. The empires that built those wedding traditions have all collapsed. What remains is the instinct, the quiet, mundane habit of reaching for another person's hand, the decision to make someone else's. Survival as important as your own. That is the real wedding. That is the thing that happened in the dark of the caves and on the banks of the Nile. It's not about the big day that we spend thousands of dollars on, it's about the hundreds of thousands of days that came before it, when our ancestors decided that being alone was the only thing more dangerous than being together. The land changed everything. As we move forward into a future where the definition of marriage continues to shift and expand, it's worth looking back at the long, strange road that brought us here. We are the descendants of the people who chose to stay. We are the children of the pair bond. Every time you see a wedding, you aren't just seeing a party, you are seeing a 300,000-year-old survival strategy in action. You are seeing the reduction of the canine teeth. You are seeing the sharing of the emmer wheat. You are seeing the morning gift. We are a species that has survived because we learned how to tie the knot across the boundaries of our own families and our own tribes. We turned a biological necessity into a cultural masterpiece, and even if we don't always get it right, the effort itself is what defines us as human. The ring is a circle for a reason. It's a symbol of something that has no beginning and no end, but it's also a boundary. It's a way of saying, this part of the world belongs to us. Whether that us is a pair of hunter-gatherers on the tundra or a couple in a high-rise apartment, the impulse is the same. We want to be known. We want to be anchored. We want to know that when we rub that spot on our finger, someone else is doing the same thing. The ancient world didn't give us love in the way we think of it today, but it gave us something perhaps more durable. It gave us the framework for commitment. It gave us the rules that allowed us to build civilizations. Without the wedding, there are no dynasties. Without the wedding, there are no inheritance laws. Without the wedding, the social fabric that holds us together would have unraveled before the first city was even built. The paper is just a memory. We often worry that marriage is dying, or that modern culture is ruining the sanctity of the institution. But history tells a different story. Marriage has always been in a state of crisis. It has always been being ruined by the next generation. The Romans thought the common weddings were ruining the elite ones. The Mesopotamians thought the changing laws were ruining the traditions of the gods. The Vikings probably thought the Christians were ruining the whole concept of the morning gift. And yet, the wedding survives every revolution. It survives every empire. It survives every change in the law. It survives because it isn't a law, it's a deep, ancient, geological part of who we are. It's as much a part of our anatomy as our heart or our lungs. The silence is the real contract. If you ever find yourself at a wedding, bored by the speeches or distracted by the flowers, try to look past the modern trappings. Try to see the 300,000 years of history standing behind the couple. See the provisioning males of the savannah. See the social networks of the Ice Age. See the property owners of the Neolithic. See the legal scholars of Babylon. They are all there, whispering their advice and their warnings. They are the ones who taught us how to do this. They are the ones who proved that two people, joined by a promise, are the strongest force in human history. We didn't invent the wedding. We discovered it like we discovered fire or the wheel. And like fire, it can keep us warm, or it can burn everything down. The path is already walked. As we bring this journey from the deep past back to the present moment, think about that quiet habit again. The thumb rubbing the finger. It's a connection to every ancestor you've ever had. It's a link to the millions of people who have stood in the dirt, the sand, and the snow to say that they would not walk alone. We are the end result of a billion eidos. Some were shouted in joy, some were whispered in fear, and some were signed in cold, hard clay. But every single one of them was a brick in the wall of the world we live in today. If this look into our deepest history changed the way you think about the rings on our fingers, or the promises we make, consider sticking around for more of these deep dives into the hidden DNA of our daily lives. There are so many more layers to peel back. The habit of rubbing that finger is more than just a nervous tick or a sensory check. It is the final, lingering vibration of a gavel strike that happened before the first word was ever spoken. We like to pretend we are the masters of our own hearts, choosing our partners with a modern, enlightened freedom. But the ancient world is still there, beneath the skin, dictating the terms of the contract. We didn't choose the wedding chose us, long ago, as a way to ensure that when the darkness comes, we aren't standing in it by ourselves. You can take off the ring and you can tear up the paper, but you cannot outrun the biology of the bond. We are chained to our history by a knot that was tied in the cold of the Ice Age, and that knot only grows tighter the more we try to pull away. The contract was signed in blood long before it was ever written in ink. The ceremony is over, but the debt remains.